Good evening, everyone. We will start the session now. I am Hatice Kahraman. I work as a research assistant at Anadolu University. I will be hosting this final session, which will be a keynote speech. Our speaker is Professor Henry Jenkins. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about Professor Jenkins. He is an American media scholar and currently a provost professor of communication, journalism, and cinematic arts, and also has a joint professorship at the UCS Annenberg School of Communication and the UCS School of Cinematic Arts. Jenkins is interested in cinema, television, comics, computer games, online communities, popular theater, and other forms of popular media, primarily in the American context. Jenkins is also interested in the ways that everyday people learn, work, create, and advocate in a context where more people have the capacity to create, curate, and circulate media content. Some of his well-known books are Textual Portraits, Television Fans and Participatory Culture, Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide, Popular Culture, and the Civic Imagination, which he will be talking about, I assume today, Civic Imagination, Case Studies of Creative Social Change, and Comics and Stuff. And now, without further ado, I am leaving the floor to Professor Jenkins to make his speech, which is titled Flying Cars and Bigots, Projecting the Post-COVID World Through the Atlas of the Civic Imagination. Floor is yours, Professor Jenkins.
Thank you so much. And I am so honored to be speaking to you today, my friends in Turkey. I've been lucky enough to have visited Istanbul several years ago. And so it has a very concreteness to me to be thinking about friends in Turkey. And I've worked with some Turkish students here. I'm definitely speaking today from an American perspective, but we're also talking about some global events. I don't mean to, I have no assumption that what I'm saying necessarily connects to anything taking place in Turkey, but I'm eager to find out from you and compare notes about some of our experiences during the difficult years that we've all been going through, especially with the COVID pandemic. But I'm definitely not one of those Americans who goes around the world telling people how to lead their lives. I'm eager to open up a dialogue and make some cultural share some cultural insights with each other. Okay, let's see, where am I? Here we go. So this talk is the result not just of my own research, but that of our research team, which includes graduate students of many races and many parts of the world. And it's been supported by the MacArthur Foundation. So I wanted to take a minute just to share the names of the people who contributed to the research in particular that I'm presenting today. As we look around the world at activism, at protest cultures, we are seeing more and more the language of popular culture is the vernacular through which young people express their desires for the future. This is an image from the women's marches that were held in the United States following Trump's inauguration 4+ years ago. And if you look there are both folk culture practices, the knitted caps that the women are wearing, and pop culture practices. History Has Its Eyes on You is a line from a Broadway musical, Hamilton, that was very popular at the time. And the woman whose eyes and hair is visible over that sign is Princess Leia from the Star Wars movies, who, following the death of Carrie Fisher, emerged as an icon for American feminism. And her image has been everywhere during these protests. These are Thai students flashing the three-finger salute from the Hunger Games as part of their protest against government crackdowns in their country. This is an image of Superman that was circulated by young immigrants in the United States to tell their story, right? They would tell us that there are no illegal aliens, there are undocumented people who are struggling for their rights in the American context. But if there was an illegal alien, it might be Kal-El from the planet Krypton, whose parents sent him away to a new life and a new world, who crossed the border in the middle of the night and was adopted by an American family who taught him to hide who he was and where he came from, and nevertheless has fought for truth, justice in the American way, wearing his ethnic clothes. The Superman outfit is made from the blankets that his parents on Krypton wrapped him in when they sent him away to the new world. So it is a classic immigrant story, and it was an immigrant story written by two Jewish refugees in the late 1930s. So it has been an immigrant story from its very beginning, and it has been used by American immigrant youth in their quest for a standing in America. This is a piece of Navajo art, which takes up a Native American art that takes up the image of Yoda from Star Wars as a shaman figure, and is asserting not only their presence in American culture, but their hopes for their own future and for the viability of indigenous culture in the United States in years to come. So all of those are just flash images of how pop culture and media content is increasingly being deployed by activist groups in the United States. And indeed, we could see similar examples in countries all over the world. Now, we have been doing work to try to understand this pattern, and we certainly see that stories of all kinds matter to any social and political movement. They matter as the way they express to each other some of their core values and commitments. Now, we're interested in the civic imagination, and by the civic, we mean a kind of social cultural foundation upon which citizenship and everyday life is conducted. It's a shared set of norms, values, commitments we make to each other as members of a community. It's the foundation to which we return as we seek to resolve disagreements and work through tensions. And it's a capacity to work together toward common goals. So the civic in our account is different from the political. The civic is the foundation upon which political life rests. Now, the political refer to struggles over the distribution of power and resources, the formation of law and policy. It's more overtly partisan than the civic. It's the space of institutional politics, though it may also include other kinds of power struggles, such as those between management or labor, between producers and consumers, and the private sector. But those struggles often get woven into political struggles and cultural struggles that are more contested space. What we see in America right now, and I think it crops up probably in news coverage all over the world, is that the political erodes the civic, that the conflicts between political parties in the United States have done damage to the civic foundation of American society in such a way that it can't renew itself, that we've seen people move to different parts of the country to consolidate their commitment to political parties. We're seeing a refusal to accept the legitimacy of the results of elections. We're seeing attempts to overturn laws once they've been passed. And that's what accounts for the fragility of America as it's operating today. Now, what we mean by the civic imagination then are certain functions that allow the civic to persist and allow political change to take place. The most basic level, before we can create a better world, we need to imagine what a better world looks like, right? And so what the civic imagination does is allows us to articulate what we're trying to build in a given society. So on one side here, I have an image of solar punk science fiction art. Solar punk is a movement which seeks to imagine environmentally sustainable futures and is part of the environmental movement in the United States and globally. The other is an image from Black Panther, and it's an image of Wakanda, and Wakanda represented an alternative view of Africa to the dominant view offered in American media, and represents a place where particularly American Black people are imagining a homeland, having had their roots to Africa shattered by the history of slavery. How do they find their way back to Africa? What Africa can they connect with? It may necessarily be a Pan-African imagination that they feel connected to. Secondly, the civic imagination says you must imagine yourself as a civic agent capable of making change. And we have two different kinds of civic agents in this picture. One is Emma Gonzalez, who's an opponent of who wants to regulate guns in the United States to prevent gun violence. She's a high school student whose school was the victim of school shootings. And she uses her jacket, that bomber jacket, to represent a range of identities. She has a Cuban flag on one arm, she's Cuban American, and on the other arm, she has the NASA emblem, she's a science student. And in the middle, she has buttons representing the whole group of constituencies that she's trying to bring together through this March for Our Lives movement. The other are images of emergency workers. This is a British poster, but we've seen it all over the US, saying superheroes wear masks. And it's part of the ongoing struggle over masks in societies around the world as part of the public health responses to COVID-19. We need to imagine a process of change. And here I have representations of Black Lives Matter and the protests that have taken place here around Black lives and racialized police violence. And on the other, we have the environmental justice movement. You need to imagine yourself as part of a community of shared interest. So here we have the Occupy Wall Street movement with the Guy Fawkes mask. And on the other side, we see Bollywood dancing being used as a tactic in the streets of Mumbai. We have to forge solidarity with groups whose perspectives differ from our own. Here we have a group of US Congress women of different races and ethnic backgrounds who've come together to form what's called the Squad. And on the other side, we see K-pop fans who participated in global protest around racial issues. And for those who are most oppressed, we have to imagine freedom, dignity, democracy, safety, participation before we directly experience them. And these are Palestinian rights advocates marching through what they call the occupied territory, dressed like Na'vi from James Cameron's film Avatar, as a way of visualizing their struggle in relation to Israel. So these are just examples we've seen worldwide that illustrate the ways in which imagination is being mobilized to allow people to imagine other possibilities in their lives. And some of these emerged from the research we did by Any Media Necessary, the New Youth Activist, which are about activist groups in the United States, the ways they use media and stories for social change. And what we heard again and again was that they are not a digital generation. This is not Twitter-based change. They are using every tool available to them. The new media have enabled them access to communication capacities they didn't have before. But as they've used it, they're also going back to posters and wheat paste and comics and street protest and any other range of media that allow them to get their messages across. So they exist in a world where many different media forms are available to them, and that's enabling them to persist in struggles over issues that have been significant to them. And the newest book, Pop Culture and the Civic Imagination, has case studies from 30 different movements around the world and how they are using media and pop culture in their political expression of one sort or another. So the work of the Civic Imagination Project, we are trying to go into communities across the United States, and we've done some work around the world, including a meeting in Beirut for educational leaders from the Arab world. And we are trying to encourage people to think creatively about the world they live in, how they might work together to solve problems they encounter in their everyday life. This is very much a civic movement. It is not a political movement. We're trying to work across political divides, but to restore communities' capacity to draw on each other as resources for fixing the issues that they confront in their everyday lives. These are some of the other literatures that we're drawing on as we're thinking about the civic imagination. These are other writers who've said and contributed things that have been really helpful for our thinking. Our approach is rooted, first of all, in what I call participatory cultures. That is, cultures where the capacity to make messages, to express messages, are shared among all members of a community, which are to some degree a byproduct of the new media technologies that people have access to. We build on fan practices often, and we're doing things like world building and story mixing as tools of the civic imagination that grow out of my more than 30 years of studying fan communities, mostly in the US, but in other parts of the world as well. We're encouraging critical and creative engagements with popular culture as resources through which the civic imagination might grow. Our notion of the imagination is not individual, but collective. How do we imagine together? What do imagining communities look like, as opposed to the imagined communities that Benedict Anderson wrote about? And we're looking at the connections between cultural practices and civic/political action. And I will stress mostly civic action in the case of the work that we're doing. So last year, we also published the book, Practicing Futures, a civic imagination action handbook, which tells instructions on how to conduct workshops and describes some of the workshops we've done in communities. Like we did a workshop with a church in Arkansas, Lutheran Church in Arkansas. We did a workshop, we've done workshops in mosques in Los Angeles. We've done workshops with tobacco farmers and coal miners in Kentucky. We did work with water bureaucrats for Southern California. All of these workshops have taught us how to conduct these meetings in such a way that they minimize conflict and allow people to share their visions for the future, their hopes, their aspirations together. So one of our projects we launched during the pandemic was the Atlas of the Civic Imagination. And our goal was to reach out globally through our networks to encourage people to share their visions for the future. Specifically, we're asking them to think of themselves in the context of 2060 and to describe how the pandemic changed their lives, right? So from the future perspective, can we think about the moment we're still living through in terms of global health crises? And by imagining that, we can think about processes of change, aspirations for change, and so forth. So let me adjust this so I can read all of this easily. Okay, so this was the prompt we use. Think about the current moment, your situation and what you see around you, your fears and concerns. Take a deep breath, inhale, exhale. And this point about breathing is actually proven really important metaphor that runs through a lot of things that we've seen come out of the last year. Now think about something that inspires you, a story from popular culture, folklore, your faith, your childhood. The story could be nonfiction, fiction, or even fantasy. It could be something that you have noticed happening around you. It could be a story about a person in your life. Imagine it is now the year 2060, and the world is as you would like it to be. What is possible in 2060? How do people live, engage, move around, learn, communicate, work, take care of themselves, etc.? Now, the stuff I haven't read is meant to emphasize it. And so there's nothing magical about the year 2060. We found that it's far enough in the future that people can imagine shift in the political divides that shape America or shape other countries around the world. We can imagine a different world in 2060. At the same time, it's close enough that we find that people still feel a connection to 2060. It's not a future they can't imagine themselves participating in, at least most of us. I may not make it to 2060, but a lot of you will. And I think it allows a more tangible vision of the future than if we extend it outward further. But for us, thinking in future terms has been key for unlocking the civic imagination. And we ask people to think about the world as we'd like it to be, not necessarily a plausible world, but a world that expresses their hopes and values. And that allows us to get closer to each other and talk about what our hopes are for the future. Okay, just a sec. So here's a quote from a young woman in Mexico who says, 2060 will not be a utopia or a dystopia. There might be flying cars and clean energy, but some basic human emotions will remain. We will still have to fight for equality, for justice, and a world for all of us, despite our differences. This requires hard work. A Holocaust happened, and we didn't learn to stop picking bigots as leaders. But we're also a world with rebels who fight for justice and equality. And I think that double-edged view comes up many times in the more than 300 stories we've collected from contributors around the planet using our atlas of the civic imagination. And I'll talk in a minute about this concept of utopia and dystopia, which science fiction literature teaches us a lot about, and I think is important for understanding how people are imagining the post-COVID world. So Henri Giroux, who's an educational researcher, talks about reality now resembles a dystopian world that only could be imagined as harrowing work of fiction. It is ominous as the foreboding appears, history is open, and how it will unfold hangs in the balance. With young people and others rising up across the world, inspired, energized, and marching in the streets, the future of radical democracy is waiting to be reimagined, if not reborn. Democracy needs to breathe again. So there's that breathing metaphor again. So when we've been doing our workshops face-to-face in America and elsewhere, we consistently heard the idea that the system as it currently existed would need to be destroyed, would melt down. There would be a catastrophe of some sort that alerted people to the fact that the lives we've been living were not sustainable, and that would force people to make dramatic changes. So we were curious in this project to see what we would hear about the current moment. Is the global pandemic the kind of catastrophe out of which changed lifestyles might emerge, changed values might emerge? And we think we're hearing some signs of that as we hear the voices from around the world. Here's a Lilith from Mexico City. We still remember 2020. People remember how the world stopped and society hit the reset button. We remember tenderly how much damage we caused to our planet and how the pandemic brought us back together, although it physically separated us for a while. Each person sought for each other as they sought for themselves, and it caused an improvement in our environment. It brought changes we never thought could have been reached in such a short period of time. Thinking about 2020 reminds us that when working together, marvelous things can be attained. It also humbles us down because the virus took over our lives catastrophically and made us learn how insignificant we really are against nature's simple organisms. So when we think about science fiction, there are indeed separations between utopian literature and dystopian literature. Utopian literature, is often described as offering an optimistic vision of the future, but it's a vision of the future that contains an implicit critique of current conditions. Indeed, the future is layered on the world we live in. So here's a solar punk future, and you can sort of see the aggregation of old school technology coupled with a reflourishing of plant life in urban areas. It's meant to be a beautiful city, but a city where infrastructure is vividly displayed. And that's intended to criticize lots of the technological practices of contemporary cities and these walls of glass that seem so impersonal to many people. The sort of factory information age images of the future. This is meant to be a more local, more slower paced alternative to it in a world where the environment is sustainable. At the same time, dystopian stories often contain discussions of resistance groups of some sort that are fighting to change the core values of their society. They always seem to put forth an alternative to the dystopian traditions, something closer to what the author might advocate for a better world. So there's not a simple, easy separation when we actually look at the pages of science fiction literature between utopian and dystopian fiction. And I think it's that ambivalence, that uncertainty, is what many of the respondents to this Atlas of the Civic Imagination shared with us. We see, nevertheless, the emergence globally of some shared values that seem important for us to think about. So the future would be eco-friendly, egalitarian, and kind. Perhaps over the next 40 years, people will change their minds and new policies will usher a golden age unlike any other in history. Maybe this is too optimistic, but this is how I like to picture the future. This is how I overcome all of the terrible things that are happening today. There are 40 years between now and 2060. This reminds me of the biblical story where the freed slaves from Egypt spent 40 years wandering around the desert before they found the promised land that God had chosen for them. Perhaps some of us will not live until 2060, and it's even more unlikely for our parents, but it is our children and grandchildren who will determine the future. And I hope they will create a future that is much better than the present we live in. So this is one of those examples where, having asked people to think about stories that inspired them, we saw faith-based stories, religious stories weave their way into the way some people understand the future. And that's very telling. But we also see that statement of the eco-friendly, egalitarian, and kind as values this optimistic person, self-declared optimist, sees as potentially shaping the future. 2060, the air is so clean, we take blue skies for granted now. The streets are lined with lush green unruliness. No one trims or edits nature anymore. The only motor vehicles that exist are for public transportation. Money is in our primary mode of transaction now. We depend a lot more on our neighbors than ever before. Everything is slower. We move at the languid pace of cows. We have the discipline of wasps building their nest. We keep things simple like street dogs. We understand that we're part of a bigger whole. The trees are kings and queens. They rule us. We live in their shade. And that's Purnima from Delhi, India. Kate from Vermont writes, a key thing that has changed between 2020 and 2060 is there is equal pay for everyone, no matter race and gender. This changed because why pay people differently because of those details, especially if they're doing the same job and working the same hours? It just doesn't make sense. And the unequal pay was causing outrage by many, and for good reason. Another thing that changed was the people of the earth now have limits on the things they're putting into the environment, like fuel, trash, greenhouse gases, etc. People are doing this to help the global crisis of climate change, and it's noticeably helping. So again, climate emerges as a central issue in many of the 300 stories that we've collected. And it's one that's often understood in a global rather than a local or national frame. It's something the world has to work together to resolve. Steve from Detroit, upon seeing the downspike in emissions during the pandemic, we drive, fly, and pollute less. The air is cleaner. You could safely swim in the Chicago River, which is notoriously polluted. We still aren't perfect. Many of our current problems are still rampant, but we're more conscious of the safety of the people and the world around us. People remember 2020 as a disruption before the new normal. So again, the crisis point out of which some new vision of the world might emerge. This is Helisu from Illinois. The key thing that has happened between 2020 and 2060 is the doomsday clock in Times Square, New York City, has run out for many years now. Climate change is now irreversible, all because of the greedy humans that stole too much. When the clock initially hit zero, humans all thought that something would happen right away. A comet would hit the Earth, or it would start blowing up. What happened was worse. Everyone now lives in constant state of worry and fear. New diseases are emerging and killing vegetation and humans. It was 10 times worse than COVID-19. But it isn't the viruses that are hurting people the most. It's the mental health issues. In an already anxiety-prone world, stress levels rise even more because of the fear of not knowing what will happen. Depression levels are magnified by the end of all humanity's situation. So this focus on mental health comes out of the realities of enormous crisis in mental health in the United States and a lack of basic services for dealing with mental health at the scale in which it's been a problem in the last year. So many of us know friends who committed suicide in the midst of the anxiety created by the pandemic. And I think the linking of that with the environmental devastation is a very poignant sign of the times we've been living through. This is Dalik from Istanbul. She did not remember how or when, but it must have been way back then. Politicians, ecologists, journalists, and more, they all faced more than they could endure. That was the time of worst despair. But chaos came with its healing glare. Yesterday's daunting destruction bared tomorrow's hopes and salvation. After all, it was in the hands of the people. Stepping up to the sacred plate, nations united under living's fate, dolphins cheered along people's laughter, the unknown tones of emerald thereafter. The olden times were there to remember what a gift life is, what a treasure. Time has lived through a caterpillar's cycle, over and over, shading for survival. Yesterday's dreams of a metamorphosis ends today at the sight of a Tiffany butterfly. And again, these nature-based images cropping up as a utopian contrast to the realities that people saw out their window during the pandemic and lockdowns in many parts of the world. For the past 2 months, since COVID-19 came, our daily routine has turned upside down, as if our life has stopped. Medications and vaccines have not come out yet. This is truly horrible. Our future is bleak. Although in Vietnam, our government has strictly controlled the spread of COVID-19 and there have been no active cases for 2 weeks, we can't be complacent. Even in America, that is praised as a free and rich country with exceptional healthcare, they couldn't cope with this pandemic. And we hear these critiques of the United States cropping up often in posts from other parts of the world, a sense that a world with only a single superpower in it is a serious threat to the ability of communities to come together and solve problems that the planet faces. So I think it was telling to us to see the ways that vision of a united planet start to take shape during this time period. Compared to 2020 and 2060, our resources are scarce due to global warming. Growing food was not as easy as before. Finding water is also complex following global warming. Most of the countries have polluted their sources of clean water. Otherwise, after 5 years of weather severity and the COVID-19 pandemic, all the countries decided to join forces to fix the planet. Now war is not a word in our vocabulary anymore. The deaths caused by the pandemic and global warming effects have created a wave of peace in the world. Most of the people would like to remember the number of resources they had back in 2020. So many people and organizations warned about the risk for our planet. Unfortunately, global leaders decided not to hear it. So this is Melo from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Manny from Atlanta, which is where I was born. Communication is vital to our survival. Where there is no communication, there can be no community. And where there is no community, there is nothing. Talk about a solid statement of what we mean by the civic. Imagine if people were able to thoroughly and attentively listen to someone who did not share their exact same beliefs, backgrounds, and experiences. Imagine if people were able to challenge the idea and not the person. We would truly have the world at our fingertips. So to wrap things up, I'm going to read a final letter and a quote from another scholar, and then give you a few closing remarks. So this is a letter that Isabel wrote to her sister who died of COVID. It's a letter from the future Isabel to Alina. I hope you are, dear Alina, I hope you are well, wherever you are. And it makes me thrilled to think that you're reading this with your biggest and most genuine smile. I still remember when you were 22 years old, how excited you got about the future, which kept you up every other night, imagining what the world would look like, things that would exist, things that would change. I would like to tell you that everything has changed, that there are flying cars, the cures for incurable diseases have been found, that poverty has ended and that wars have stopped. But I'd be lying to you. However, some things have changed. We became more human. As humanity, we have faced many challenges. After the pandemic that you lived and in which we lost you, we have fought many other and more lethal battles. We struggled to understand the damage caused by our lifestyle of irresponsible consumption. We bonded with each other, of course. We're no longer filled with hatred, selfishness, and individualism. Pain and necessity have changed us. I know you would be proud of the transformation we have achieved, and even more so to be part of it. I love you, I miss you, I reminisce of you, your beloved sister, Isabel. So I'm returning to Henry Giroux, the pedagogical theorist, who tells us amid the corpses produced by neoliberal capitalism and COVID-19, there are also flashes of hope, a chance to move beyond the contemporary resurgence of authoritarianism, beyond the normalizing ideologies of a poisonous cynicism and paralyzing conformity endemic to neoliberal capitalism. There's a growing movement to reclaim the collective political vision that is more compassionate, equitable, just, and inclusive. So we like to think that the stories that have been posted to the Atlas of the Civic Imagination, stories that are enabled by the global reach of digital technology, represent the kind of flashes of hope that he's talking about. And that the values we hear consistently, mostly from young people around the world, are for something that is more compassionate, equitable, just, and inclusive than the world before the pandemic. So that's the work of the civic imagination and the work of the Atlas of the Civic Imagination. We're trying to hear voices we might not otherwise hear and trying to use them to encourage reflection together about what a better world might look like and what kinds of civic relationships might exist between people on all parts of the planet. And with that, I close my formal remarks.
Thank you very much. It was invigorating and a little bit sad with the person that wrote to her sister. I hope all people who lost their lives rest in peace, and I hope we will see better futures soon. And before asking if there are any questions, I want to ask you, what do you see in the future? You haven't told about yourself.
Well, I'm always an optimist, right? I have to say the last couple of years have really tested my optimism. It's been a really bad time to be in the United States and a really bad time to be in the world the last few years. I do see those flashes of hope, and I do believe that humans are going to work to resolve problems that endanger all of us. I do like to believe that we can move toward a more environmentally sustainable future. I don't believe you can have politics without hope. So without hope, there's, we're cynically accepting the conditions we've been given. And I think we have to work hard together to achieve the better world of our imagination. So that's how I would sum up my hope for the future. I definitely believe environmental issues are some of the most urgent ones at the current time, but there are many other urgent issues to be fought. Black Lives protests were taking place right outside my window here in downtown Los Angeles. We could hear the shouts from inside the building and see the confrontation that was taking place there. So that cause speaks very strongly to me when I think about my own country, and many such causes.
Yeah, you are right. We have a lot of issues to solve before getting further in the future. And do you have any questions? If you have questions, you can turn your microphone on, or you can write on the chat box.
Good evening, everyone. So I don't have any questions, but I'm here, and I would like to state my thanks to Professor Jenkins, especially because just wait. So I'm so excited to be as a presenter here in this symposium with you, dear Professor, because you are a really, I agree with you, you are a really optimistic storyteller of the new media, especially because you are an you inspire us as new media researchers. And I believe that when you talk about all the civic imagination and the future, I'm a bit optimistic too. I see that pandemic process as a big bang. So we need a big bang. So if we have a big bang, then we can reach some releasing times, I think. So and I would like to state I'm quite excited because you don't remember me exactly, but you inspired me in my PhD times. I sent an email to you before my PhD dissertation about transmedia storytelling. And you didn't deny me in any way my emails, and I again want to thank you again. So we are happy to have a professor like you as new media researchers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My optimism is often misunderstood, I think, by some more critical people. And so I should describe a little bit of how I think about the process of theory and its relationship to changing the world. So to begin with, before we can critique, we actually have to analyze, document, record, understand the existing conditions. Then critique is a useful tool for questioning what's unfair or wrong in the society that we're inheriting. But then beyond that, we need to seek out alternatives and show what those alternatives are. And I believe that's where most of my work falls, is documenting alternatives that are actually working in the world, these flashes of hope, as Giraud described them here, that allow us to identify what a different world might look like through the lens of the civic imagination. And then the last step is intervention, which is why we go out in the world and we do these workshops and work on the ground with communities. And we're working on environmental issues, and we're working on polarization in the United States as things that we can make a difference with. So my optimism is grounded in real world exposure, real world understanding. I simply spend less time at the critique phase than a lot of the people I interface with in the academic world. I see them already doing that work, and I think the critique is really valuable, but they don't need me to do it. They're doing that part well by themselves, and what I can do better is document the alternatives and see what I can do to inspire actual change. And that's where my political commitment comes from. Now, I do remember corresponding with you. I couldn't have told you your name or recognized your face from this time, but I do remember the correspondence, and I love hearing from scholars and students all over the planet, and that we can engage with thoughtfully and share ideas with each other. And as I said, I feel very close to Turkey, now, you know, because of students and correspondence and others that I've had from your country. So it is exciting for me to have a chance to talk to you. And I hope someday soon I can make it back to Turkey and see some of you people in class.
So hope.
Break bread together.
I hope so. Thank you.
Any other questions? If there isn't, I have a little question.
Okay.
You have shown a lot of examples from different people, and they had some different backgrounds, but you haven't told us about their age range. How old were they?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't collect that data in the first round. We had seen this as an artistic intervention, and we asked people to share what they wanted to share about themselves. Most of them didn't share age. Those that did range from high school students, people in their early teens, up through senior citizens. So we did get a range of voices, but this is not data we can interpret on a quantitative level, almost by design. We're trying to draw some insights from it. But one of the reasons I present this the way I do, as just a series of voices, is because I think we learn more qualitatively by hearing these stories than we do quantitatively or traditional statistical analysis. And yeah, I'd love to know the age. I really would. We've done our workshops face-to-face with everything from 13-year-olds to people in their early 90s. The workshop practices we've developed work for all age groups and have worked in settings around the world. They're very flexible to allow different groups to respond in that way. So some of them are being used in educational settings, schooling settings. Some of them are being done by community groups. As I said, we've done multiple ones in mosques in Los Angeles because we studied American Muslim youth during the work that we did for By Any Media Necessary. And we have had people conducting them all over the world, including a group that did 30 of them in Pakistan, trying to help Pakistanis understand the nature of their own nation, what it is to be from Pakistan. And had some really amazing results come out of the research that group has done in Pakistan. So it may not everything in that book may not work for every community, given the social, cultural, political, legal situations they're all in, but there's enough that's adaptable in those practices that we're finding good results in many parts of the world. But for the Atlas project, we didn't ask for a lot of personal data. We wanted to keep the boundaries low for people to be able to contribute. And it probably was a mistake not to ask the age question. We've realized as we've gotten into trying to explain what we found. I suspect they're mostly young. We worked with a lot of teachers in countries to get classes to write and submit because we had strong contacts there.
Yeah, I asked because the way they present themselves, the way they think, I thought all of them were young, and I imagined what would older people, elderly people think about this. That's why I asked. Other than that, I think the data being qualitative is a better way to show us how people think, and you know, mostly the analysis I see are all numbers. I don't like it that way. This way we can see and touch their actual feelings. That's why I think your way of presenting is more valuable than the numbers. And thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, when we have done workshops of senior citizens, we see certain anxieties about the future and about change, which affects seniors' lives in a very intimate way. We also see a lot about the persistence of things they valued and treasured throughout their lives. You know, one of the things we do when we do a workshop on the ground is we ask people to bring an object that reminds them of who they are and where they came from, and tell the story to the group. And it started as an icebreaker, just a way to get to know the participants, but it's become a central part of our ritual, because we find for older people, for more conservative people in particular, paying tribute to tradition and where they're from frees them up to then imagine the future together in such a way that they're more open to the possibility of change if they believe that they might carry with them the things that they value the most. And we're deeply respectful of tradition and the work that we do. And you saw the many references to faith, you know, in the work that we do, and on all faiths is an important part of how we practice, because faith-based communities have often been, which is where we find our oldest participants in many cases, are often, you know, centers for civic values and civic connections people have in their lives.
And there is a comment from Gizem Parlayan Demir. She says, me and my transmedia narratives lecture students all love you. Thank you for your existence and optimism, she says.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I've been so excited to see transmedia classes all over the planet. And I know some Turkish drama producers have been doing really extraordinary work with that. My former student, Sebden Baran, studies Turkish television in the global context. And she wrote something on my blog last week about the flow of Turkish television and transmedia that might be of interest to your students. So the blog is at henryjenkins.org. And we're running this series on global fandom, bringing together scholars from 45 nations to talk to each other about what fandom means in their country. And Sebden is represented the Turkish scholarly world in that.
I just wrote your blog's name to chat box, and I think Professor Nilüfer Pembecioğlu has something to say.
Yes, hello. It's so nice to have a chance to listen to you again. And I have a very little tiny question. I'm wondering about the media impact on the civic creativity, because in the pictures you showed us, there was the salute from the Hunger Games. There were the masks from Vendetta. There were the colors of the avatar. You know, we see a certain media impact on the civic society. So do you think that it's a kind of a reaction to media, or do you think that it's a kind of a connecting dots together to make it more popular and understandable for all? What's your reaction? I just wonder.
I mean, well, this is not a simple question, but I'll do my best to answer it. You know, we've been following this for quite a while, and by any media necessary, we were seeing the emergence of forms of fan activism around Harry Potter in particular, but also the Nerd Fighters, which is a kind of YouTube celebrity-driven fan activism. And we were seeing that those reference points were really important for young people in the United States. And then we started seeing them crop up around the world. Now, my mentor when I was in graduate school was a guy named John Fisk, who really had argued that micropolitics took place around our relations to popular culture that could eventually contribute to major political movements around the world. And I had predicted in the end of my book, Convergence Culture, that the skills we used in play on the internet would translate into skills for larger political, spiritual, educational purposes as that generation grew older. And I think our predictions both have proven to be true. It's not that they're not media influences that are negative, right? They're, you know, in the United States, we have deeply partisan news coverage that has ensured the divides on a political level that make America a very unstable country at the current time and led to that insurrection in Washington, D.C., beginning of this year. On the other hand, we are seeing young people find these raw materials from pop culture that use as symbols to express their visions of the future, the way earlier generations might have turned to classical mythology or religious text as stories that they could tell their stories, their experiences through. These stories serve the same function for them. And to read it as media influence maybe is only part of a picture, because they're mapping their meanings, their identity, their experiences onto these icons. And we're seeing some of the same pop culture references used by right and left wing political movements. We're seeing them used in a variety of ways. So they are something that can be appropriated and remixed on the ground, but they are shared reference points that the upside, if there is an upside of global cultural circulation, particularly of American media text, has been that it gives a shared framework for people in many parts of the world. And this is what we're seeing in the Global Fandom Jamboree I'm running in my blog, is cultural exchange creates new imaginings of the world that can be shared. And it could be Squid Games, which is Netflix top hit in 80 countries at this point. Or it could be, from Korea, or it could be K-pop music, or it could be Bollywood, or it could be regionally specific exchanges like Latin telenovelas and social dramas and historical dramas from Turkey, and any number of other things that are spreading across regions. But those things give shared symbols that connect people together. And it's what we do with those symbols that matters. I'm always interested in what we do with media rather than what media does to us. But obviously we live in a world where media is a major factor in our lives and our imaginations for the future. It has an influence. That's why I go back to Hollywood in my home city now, and bring messages from our Civic Imagination workshops to media makers who are making the next generation of Hollywood stories, so they understand the effect those images have and think more deeply about the choices they're making on how to represent power or equality or diversity in their media properties. So that's part of the intervention work that I do. Is it matters what the stories were told, but it also matters what we do with those stories.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We are running up our time, but we have one more question, and a few other people thanking you for this invigorating presentation and inspiring. And what do you think lies ahead for fan studies, says Ece Nurkaya?
Well, I think what I'm trying to do right now and helping to surface fan scholars in countries around the world is what I would like to see happen next. Fan studies started in the United States. It has continued to have an Anglo-American bias in terms of what cultures are represented. At least in English language, which is the only language I have access to, which is my limitation. I've learned very little so far about fan cultures, say, in the Muslim world. And that's a really interesting topic that I'd like to know more about. We're starting to see debates in China over fandom as China grapples with consumer capitalism as part of its multi-economy system. So I think understanding the cultural flow and exchange is really important. And what I tried for in this series are younger scholars, early career scholars, people finishing their PhDs, people entering their teaching positions in countries around the world, so that they become more visible as scholars in a global network of scholarship on fandom that could make a difference. I definitely think topics like the connections between fandom and activism are really important. I think questions like race and racism in fandom are important. I think continuing to understand gender, and particularly fan masculinities, given much of the work to date has been about fan femininity. I think there's a lot to be done. I think breaking down the walls between the study of sports, music, and cult media is an important dimension of where fandom is going. And not just, and I think we're seeing work on gender nonconformity, non-binary, gender fluid fans as something that needs to be done right now to challenge the gender essentialism of the ways in which fandom has been written about. I mean, the great thing, I've been writing about fandom for more than 35 years at this point. And the great thing I've discovered is that every new wave of fans that I stumble into teaches me something new about the potentials of fandom as a cultural space. And it's a lens through which we can ask all kinds of questions about the societies we live in. So I'm totally excited about the future of fandom studies. I will keep reading as long as I'm on this planet to try to understand as much as I can about other cultures through the lens of fandom.
I think I read somewhere that you are a fan yourself. That's why you are combining your academic works,
Yes.
fandom. That's a great way to work, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a fan since I was a child. I've been active in fan communities my entire life. And so what I know is, I try to teach my students that what they know as fans is as important as what they know as scholars. And it's our ability to bring those kinds of knowledges together that generates the most important work that we can do in the space. And I'm very much inspired by Raymond Williams, the founder of British Cultural Studies, who insists on the importance of theories matching our own experiences and our own identities. And that is as true of theories of fandom as it's true of any other dimension of our culture.
Yes, that's true. And I've been told that we may extend our time a little bit if you are not tired. And if there are any other questions. Are there any other questions before we close this session? Anyone? I think that's all.
Well, given the late hour there, I seem to have exhausted the audience, even if I'm not exhausted myself.
Then if there isn't any questions, we may finish. Thank you very much, Professor Jenkins. It's been a great honor to have you in our symposium, and I feel very lucky to host this session. We hope to see you in person in future. Maybe you will come to Turkey in our next symposium, I don't know.
I'd love to come to Turkey sometime soon. I'm not sure quite when I'll be able to get there, but I definitely would love to see many of you in person.
We would like to welcome you anytime you come. And now I am ending this session, and now Associated Professor Dr. Ayhan Doğan will moderate the closing remarks. Thank you all for attending this session, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you.